Hello, thank you for asking me to speak here today. And my name is Sandra Capelin, and I've been asked to speak about my family's experiences of living with a child with a developmental language disorder. Well, I can definitely say it was certainly a challenge. But we all grow up, and Rachel is now in her late 40s, and I'm pleased to say she's the proud mother of two beautiful girls, one of whom is now at university and the other attending college. Rachel herself did go to college, albeit 1 year later than her peers, where she passed exams and has worked successfully ever since. And she's currently working as a family support worker. They are aware of her problems and they offer her support as required, but this certainly isn't every week, just occasionally. Just for the record, Rachel's family consisted of herself, her brother Gary, and Phil and I as her parents, and this is how we coped. Obviously, the person who suffered most was Rachel, because she was born with a DLD that went undiagnosed until she was 16 years old, despite the fact that I was repeatedly asking for help from both health and educational professionals throughout her childhood. I knew something was wrong from the moment she was born, because she did nothing but scream for hours on end every day until she was about 2.5 years old. And she'd lost 2¼ pounds within the first 10 days of her life. That's 1,021 grams for those that prefer metric. But still, the professionals just ignored my requests for help. I was a qualified registered sick children's nurse with a happy, easygoing son of 20 months old. So why couldn't I cope with this baby? But all the midwife and the health visitors could advise, I'd already tried, because I knew those tricks from being a nurse myself. But they just said, go away, try again. I was utterly disillusioned and exasperated by my own profession, because not only that, when I did get to see a paediatrician, he told me I had a bad-tempered child that I had to learn to manage before she managed me. Instinctively, I knew something was wrong, but no one would listen to me, and I didn't know what to do. It was very scary and frustrating. Now, I know we shouldn't compare our children, but as I said, Gary was a placid, easy to manage child. He could write his own name at 3 years old and was wanting to read before he left playgroup. Whereas, although Rachel cried less as she grew older, she didn't seem to know how to play with her own toys. So she was very difficult to amuse, which was quite a problem to keep her occupied. And at playgroup, we just saw the gap widening between Rachel and her peers, as she mainly just ran around all the large apparatus, unless a playgroup leader directed her to sit down and played with her and showed her what to do. She could barely draw a stick person by the time she started school, and Rachel failed to read or write until she was about 7 years old. I can't tell you how hard this was to watch. It was heartbreaking, but if we tried to discuss our concerns with the teachers, they just dismissed us as fussy parents and told us, you're expecting too much from her. She's really not as bright as you think she is, you know. And yet I was dragging Rachel to school screaming by the time she was 6.5 years old on a daily basis, so she wasn't happy either. We therefore insisted that she saw the school's educational psychologist, who told us he stopped counting at 120 for her IQ, so she really was bright, but he did diagnose specific learning difficulties. And when I asked him, do you think she has a problem with language? Because I was beginning to suspect this by then, he just dismissed it and said, let's get rid of the learning difficulties first and see what we're left with. And then he moved away. There were times when I thought I was going mad. I constantly questioned myself. Surely all those professionals can't be wrong. It must be me. I'm a neurotic mother. But deep down, I knew something was wrong for Rachel. So I did my best to try and work out what it was and how we could help her. Now, one of the things I did was to start some diaries when Rachel was about 4 years old. And I began by listing all the problems that she had and all the things she found difficult, and then tried to work out how we could help her. And I prioritised them and started working on this, reviewing everything we did on a monthly basis in the diaries and seeing if any progress had been made. And I also recorded any bad days she had, if she had terrible tantrums or meltdowns because things were wrong for her. But by reading through these diaries every so often and analysing them, I kept coming to the same conclusion. She's a bright enough child, but she doesn't seem to understand things. It must be to do with her language. Yet if ever I asked for a speech and language assessment, I was told, you have to go through the school. But of course, they dismissed me. Her articulation's good, they said. There's nothing wrong with her speech. She's fine. And when I did finally get through to the speech and language therapists, lo and behold, she was either too old for some of the tests or too young for the others. So we got nowhere there. Even when Rachel did learn to read, she was barking at print. That is to say, she never understood the story, and she certainly couldn't answer any questions that were asked about it afterwards. All through her education, we felt as though we were educating Rachel ourselves. School did absolutely nothing, I'm afraid, apart from put her in a remedial class for 1 year, which she hated because she felt different from those children. She had a good IQ, so she really didn't fit in with either her peer group that she couldn't keep up with or the children in the remedial class. And so I scoured the libraries. I read everything I could lay my hands on to try and find out what we were dealing with and different ways of trying to reach her. Until one day I realised I couldn't tell her anything and I couldn't show her anything. But if I involved her, she learned through tactile and kinesthetic learning. Even in senior school, Rachel would smuggle books home that should never have left the premises. And after that, I would teach her that particular topic in our way, got through to her, and she would do the work or homework at home and then try to keep up with her peers again. And when it came to Hamlet that she had to study for English, well, the Shakespeare textbook was not for Rachel. So I went out, and I know we shouldn't advertise, but I bought her the Ladybird version of the children's basic story, which worked a treat. It really was a battle all the way through until we got that diagnosis 3 days after she'd finished her last GCSE. And that is why I wrote this book. Don't know if you can see it there, but Rachel, the Right to Speak, I wrote because I didn't want other parents to suffer the way we had. I wanted them to find out that if you battle on long enough, you can succeed and get there. Yes, I know things are better now, as people are understanding more about language and are aware of the disorders that are out there. But I'm also aware that Courtney Norbury's research has shown that 7% of all primary school children have got a DLD, 50% of which goes undiagnosed. And for those who are lucky enough to get a diagnosis, there is still a lack of resources due to all the cutbacks. So it's still difficult to get the help that's needed. As I said, I continually pursued the professionals and repeatedly requested assessments to try and get help for Rachel throughout her childhood. But it was pure coincidence when we did finally get a diagnosis. And this was because I was then working as a teaching assistant in a unit for hearing impaired children, where I had made friends with a dinner lady. And we were just chatting one day, and she was telling me about her daughter, who had been diagnosed with a DLD and was attending a special school for children with communication, speech and language problems. Now this little girl wanted to go to Brownies, but Mum was very worried, would she cope? And I started telling her about how I'd noticed that her daughter was very similar to how mine had been, and that Rachel had loved Brownies because it was so practically based and fun and full of games and enjoyment, where she didn't feel different from anyone else. And through this conversation, I just happened to mention my diaries that I'd kept. Now this lady asked to read my diaries, which I lent her. And unbeknown to me, she showed them to her daughter's head teacher at the special school. And when she gave them back, my friend said, "My daughter's head teacher is convinced that your daughter has a language disorder, and she'd like to meet you at the next aphasic parent support group meeting, which just happens to be next week." So of course I went along, and when we met, she told me then that she was more than happy to refer us to her friend, who just happened to be the chief speech and language therapist at Guy's Hospital. And that was when and how we got our diagnosis. Now, when I asked Rachel's brother how life was for him growing up with such a demanding sister, thankfully he said he didn't remember it like that, for which I'm very grateful. However, after reading all those books and analysing my diaries on how to help Rachel, I decided to spend 30 minutes every day in the school holidays on projects that I devised myself in order to try and help her overcome the problems with the basic literacy skills or any school topic that was worrying her. But when the teachers found out we were doing this, they criticised us for pushing her. However, I always had a science project or a fun thing for Gary to do running alongside this so that he felt included as well, and I didn't make him feel left out. I felt that was important with all the time I was giving her. But to be honest, I think coping and communicating with Rachel just became our normal way of life in the end. But it did take up a lot of time. When Rachel eventually did learn to write her name at about 7 years old, it was mirror imaged. She'd begin with the L and work through to the back to front R, a reversed R. It was most bizarre. And so I decided to try and teach her the correct letter shapes in one of our holiday projects. And we did this by touch, guiding her finger over rough surfaces, in sand, on the carpet, different textured materials, embossed wallpaper, and even writing letters on people's backs. And then we played games by trying to guess what the letter was that was being written on our back. We then rolled out lengths of Play-Doh and made all the letter shapes from those. And finally, when she was doing that consistently correctly, I wrote the letters out in black felt pen and got her to go over them in as many different coloured crayons that she could find. And in that way, we reinforced the learning through muscle memory. And when we were successful with that, we did it all again with the numbers because she used to reverse those as well. As I said, it all took a lot of time. So much so that if my husband Phil came home from work and he saw me trying to sort out yet another problem for Rachel or doing some work with her that she'd brought home from school, he would just set to and start cooking the family meal, bless him. He supported me 100% in all of this because, like me, he believed that we were coping with something that no one else could see or believed us about. He also supported me when I went to meetings or consultations to try and fight yet another cause for Rachel, even though we felt we were banging our heads against brick walls all that time. Phil also made Rachel some 10-centimetre rods and 1-centimetre cubes, so that I could try and teach her the concept of tens and units in a practical way, which worked wonderfully. So how was all this for Rachel? She certainly suffered from lots of phobias, like standing or refusing to stand on sand because it didn't feel secure to her, like the grass or the concrete pavements. She was petrified of any moving water, especially the sea, even though we lived by the beach. And she hated loud noises, especially motorbikes revving up. So much so that she would refuse to enter a room if she saw her grandfather's crash helmet on the table, because to Rachel, that awful noise could just emanate from the helmet at any time. She really didn't understand anything, the situations or why things happened the way they did. She also suffered from immense frustration tantrums throughout her childhood, especially if she couldn't make herself understood or she didn't understand something we were trying to tell her. And then she would throw herself down on the ground, hammer away with her hands and feet, and sob uncontrollably for about 30 minutes at a time. But this was only ever done in private at home. She would never do this outside. There, she'd present as a timid, shy little wallflower. Maybe not someone very bright, because she wouldn't engage with strangers or make conversation. And if they asked her a question, she'd just say yes, no, or I don't know. And her best friends were always younger than her. However, when I asked Rachel this question, ready for this talk, she said that she couldn't really remember anything, which didn't surprise me, because Rachel has no real memories from before she was 14 or 15 years old. However, she can recall feeling lonely and fearful, and this can still haunt her at times. And she can panic if she meets new people and goes to new situations, when her brain will freeze up and she seems unable to speak. Hence, I'm representing her here today. Well, I hope that covers everything, all our views on how it was for us with a child growing up with a developmental language disorder, and I hope it's been helpful. And I'm happy to answer any questions if required. Thank you. Switch off?
Yeah, and didn't
Didn't see it.
And you have to wait for it to